Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of El Nino Speaks. And today I have the great pleasure of having on Mark Weber, the director of the Institute for Historical Review. How are you doing, Mark?
Very good. Great.
I have long appreciated your work, which has been like multi-decade in nature, but I'm going to assume that a lot of people that are in my audience aren't so familiar with it. So please go ahead and give a brief overview of your body of work and what you're doing well into the present.
Well, the focus has changed over time. It's become, I think, much more relevant to what's going on in our world today, especially in the last 5, 10 years, because I think it's fair to say that events are happening with greater acceleration than at any other time in my life. Basically, what I try to do is look at current events from a historical perspective and to look at history as it's relevant to our time. I think that an enormous defect or problem in our society is a failure of any kind of historical understanding, awareness. In a society that puts a big emphasis on the individual, the emphasis, almost everyone then is inclined to look at things in terms of his or own lifetime. And they lack the understanding or even the care about what happened in times past. But that's about as foolish as trying to understand medicine or astronomy, geology, or engineering on the basis of what one learns in one's own lifetime. And in fact, we benefit enormously in every other field of endeavor based on what we know happened in the past, because as much as things change, we're still human beings, and human beings have a human nature that does not change. It's that way throughout history. And that's an enormous problem in our society, is the failure of any real understanding of history other than the most superficial or sort of sloganeering. So I put an enormous emphasis on history as it's relevant today, particularly. And that's why a lot of the focus of what I've written about and talked about over the years has been on the 20th century, and particularly the Second World War, because the world we live in today, the United States and Western Europe particularly, and up until recently around the rest of the world, was very much the result of the post-war order that emerged from the wreckage of the Second World War. And today, though, I think it's fair, I think people acknowledge this across the board, the United States, Western Europe, Western society, European society is in a crisis. That's more and more obvious. And things have not turned out the way that our leaders, our educators, and so forth promised in the optimistic era of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And people today, more than ever, I think, in American history, are very confused about what went wrong, because things are not in America today what everybody expected, especially when I was young. And the country was a much more optimistic society. So much of what we write about, what I've talked about and dealt with in recent years, has been to really try to shed light and understanding and raise awareness about the, I think, more and more obvious crisis of the West and the United States today. So that's a kind of a general point, but I deal a great deal with the Second World War. And an understanding of that, I think, is very important, because our leaders, both Republican and Democrat, draw certain inferences and conclusions from the outcome of the Second World War that I think are very mistaken, because they're based on a mistaken understanding of the very nature of the Second World War itself. And that has done a lot to get us into the trouble we are today, I think, in America. So those are kind of general statements. I would say, just as a matter of caution, that if you look up Institute for Historical Review or me on Wikipedia, or if you go to the Southern Poverty Law Center, what you'll get is an enormously distorted and very inaccurate view of, I think, what I what's important to me, what I believe, and so forth. That's not unusual. And in a way, the situation is much better than it used to be because so many people are justifiably, understandably very skeptical of what the establishment, including Wikipedia and so forth, has to say. Anyway, that's a kind of a general point. I think that we have an impact. I know we do, because many people who don't even sort of acknowledge what we do have been influenced by what I and other writers and speakers and so forth through the IHR have had to say over the years. And I'm very gratified, very encouraged by the fact that many, many more younger people, especially, agree with points we've been making for many, many years. And that's a very encouraging aspect. Of course, what we do is criticized, vilified, damned by the establishment, and we're called all sorts of terrible names. But I'm very confident that the more time goes on, the more the unfolding of events vindicates our essential outlook, the skeptical view we've had about official history and so forth. And I think this is becoming more and more accepted or understood by more and more people, the more that this society is in the crisis that it's in.
One word that you brought up there, sloganeering, really caught my attention because when we look at all forms of political analysis these days, especially the mainstream analysis that comes either from like the neoliberals or like neoconservative sets, it's based on slogans and just banal concepts such as American exceptionalism, for example. And you have routinely railed against that concept. What is American exceptionalism and how did it come into being?
Yes, I have, because I believe that the outlook of both you might say, the left, the Democratic Party in America, and the right, the Republicans, about American history, about world history, and about our identity is wrong. They're both wrong. And they're both wrong for similar but also slightly different reasons. American exceptionalism was a term coined supposedly by Alexis de Tocqueville, the French writer who wrote his famous book, Democracy in America, in the 1820s, 1830s. And he was very interested. He spent time in the United States, was a very keen observer, very shrewd man, and wrote about that. And he was especially struck by the contrast between the American Revolution, the American experience in forming a republic, and breaking away from Britain, and comparing that with the French Revolution of 1789 and the chaos and so forth there. And he compared America very favorably to that. But that's not what American exceptionalism has come to mean in our time. The word is used now very, very frequently by political leaders, not just Republicans, but also Democrats. Barack Obama, in an address to graduates, I think at West Point, he said, "I believe in American exceptionalism with every fiber of my being," he said. And Donald Trump used the term repeatedly throughout the election campaign that put him in the White House this time, and in his inaugural address. In fact, he said with the usual Trumpian exaggeration, America is going to be even more exceptional than ever, I think. He said something like that. In fact, he even said that as part of this American exceptionalism, impossible is what America does, he says. Now, again, this is kind of exaggeration, but both Republicans and Democrats, most Americans like to hear this idea of American exceptionalism. But very few people are able to define it very clearly, except it has a vague idea behind it, is this vague idea that America is a better country than others. We either have more freedom or more opportunity, and also it implies a kind of moral superiority the United States has. Now, there's many, many expressions of this that you can find. Madeleine Albright, who was, of course, a very important person in the Carter administration, she said, "If we have to use force," she said, she was Secretary of State, "if we have to, it has become, we are America. We are the indispensable nation. We stand tall and we see further than other countries into the future. And we see the danger here to all of us. There's many expressions of this idea that America is different, even better than any other countries. And there's a foundation for that. It's not just taken out of thin air, because for many years, Americans lived better than people anywhere else. When America was founded as a country in a Declaration of Independence in 1776, white Americans lived better than people anywhere in the world. And from the period of the founding of America up until fairly recently, American expansion, American productivity, the American impact on the world, and the American prosperity was unparalleled. It was astonishing, really. Now, many people like to say, well, that proves how good we are. We're really better. But there's objective reasons why America is, in a certain way, an exceptional country. There's two main reasons. The first one is this: America is an exceptionally individualistic country. And that means it's not bound by, like other countries, by tradition, by custom in the way that other countries have been. And the reason for that is that the people who moved to the United States from Europe and from other countries, including the present, from everywhere in the world, come here as individuals. They don't come here because they particularly care about American society or American history or American heritage. They come because life will be better for themselves and their families. That's why they come here. And so America has, uniquely of all the great countries of the world and most important countries of the world, a highly individualistic outlook and an individualistic temperament, because people came here as individuals. They didn't come here as people of another thing to make a branch of the country they came from. They came because life was going to be good for themselves as individuals. So that's one aspect. The other is that America did very, very well for the objective reason that when it was settled in the 18th, 19th, 20th century, early 20th century by Europeans, it was settled by people from, at that time, the most advanced, productive, developed civilization in the world, namely Europe, and came to a continent that was basically there for the taking, a continent with enormous, abundant resources. That's an immensely important aspect of all of this. Americans sort of take for granted the tremendous bounty of the United States. They came to a continent with enormous, huge millions of acres of fertile soil, which hadn't been developed really in history, huge forests, large deposits of iron ore, coal, petroleum, gold, silver, all of those things, and a continent also with very good harbors. That shouldn't be overlooked as well. And so people coming from an advanced culture, and the only people here were Stone Age Indians, natives, who didn't even have really communication among themselves, were unable to offer any real resistance. That's why America expanded so well, so rapidly. That's the main reason for that. And that individualism was also a very good factor in developing America in a very rapid way, in a very no holds barred, with enormous opportunity for taking advantage of this. And so America did extraordinarily well. And then finally, there's another aspect of American exceptionalism that's very relevant for our time. And you'll find this underlying the outlook that both Joe Biden and Donald Trump have had. It's they take for granted America's preeminence in the world during the time that they grew up, when they were boys and young men. America was on top. And it was that way, not because, the main reason America was number one in the world in so many ways: finance, production, engineering, and so forth in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and so prosperous, was because America was the only major country in the world, industrial country, that hadn't been destroyed in the Second World War. The rest of the world was in ruins. China was, at the end of the war, not only destroyed itself, but was still in the throes of a civil war. Japan was ruined, destroyed, of course, during the Second World War. Europe, Russia, the rest of the world was really on its back. And so America, the period of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, up into the 80s, was one of just unbelievable, historically unparalleled prominence, preeminence by the United States in the world. And so people, especially older people, took that for granted. They think, well, that's the norm. That's the way things should be. We're number one. And this is reflected in the campaign slogan of the Trump campaign. He wants to make America great again. And what he means by that, although he doesn't really articulate it very well, is this vague idea he wants to restore America to the place it was in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, when he was younger and when Americans were enormously confident and so forth. Anyway, that's the major point, though, is to stress about this. And I try to make this point, and something that younger people are more aware of is the world has changed drastically since the youth of people like Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Today, the world is not on its back anymore. The entire relationship of the United States with the rest of the world has changed. It was in the Reagan years, in the 1980s, that America changed from being the number one creditor nation in the world to the number one debtor nation in the world. Instead of having enormous trade surpluses, America now has continual trade deficits. In order to sustain even the standard of living that we have in the United States, it's necessary to print a lot of money and that's not really backed up to go into debt. And America now sustains itself with just massive, unbelievable levels of debt for peacetime. The only comparable period was during the Second World War. I often make the point that to compare that, and it's very hard for younger people, I think, to really grasp this. Right after World War II, something like 95% of the automobiles made in the world were made by General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. Today, every day, China produces more automobiles than Japan and the United States combined. And China is now the number one manufacturing country in the world and is rapidly on its way to being the number one economy in the world. That's very hard for Americans who grew up in the 50s, 60s, and 70s to sort of get their head around because it seems so unnatural. It's not the way it should be. And when Donald Trump talks about making America great again, he has this idea that we should be the number one. You know, when Joe Biden took office, he announced to the world, once again, he said, America is ready to lead the world. Well, America doesn't have that position in the world that it had when he was young and when he took for granted America's place in the world. Anyway, those are all some of the reasons why there is this idea of American exceptionalism and why it's changing. I want to just mention a couple of other things. The most popular Republican president of modern times was Ronald Reagan during the 1980s. Yeah. And he was enormously beloved, I think, because he was such an effective communicator. He had been, during World War II, he made propaganda films for the U.S. government. He was a movie actor, and he spoke in a very uplifting, upbeat sort of way. And he, probably more than any other modern American president, not only talked about America in this as a kind of an exceptional society, he articulated it in a very kind of moving way that everybody sort of was caught up. Many times he made statements like this, and I'm just giving one quote, but he made similar statements many times. I've always believed that this anointed land, that's the United States, was set apart in an uncommon way, that a divine plan placed this great continent here between the oceans to be found by people from every corner of the earth who had a special love of faith and freedom. Now, that's pretty lofty stuff, and people love to hear that. They want to hear how we're special, we're better, we have special love of freedom. And, of course, what that exactly means is a little vague, but he said, here's another one. He said, I've always believed that ours is a chosen land, that it was placed here by some divine providence, placed here between the two oceans to be sought out and found by people from every corner of the earth, people who have a special love for freedom and the courage to uproot themselves and leave their homelands and friends and to come here to create something new in all the history of mankind, a country where man is not beholden to government, but government is beholden to man. Now, this is widely accepted. Nobody really objects to it. It sounds good. And Americans love to hear things that make are self-flattering, of course. That's part of this American exceptionalism. But it's also a dangerous thing. It's dangerous because out of this kind of hubris comes an idea that we're not subject to the realities of history, of relations between people, of society, racial, ethnic, cultural differences, that Americans are so special, so individualistic. From wherever we come, the magic of America will make this country and our society work well, no matter what else will happen. Here's an example. In his acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention in 1980, he said this. This is a remarkable thing. He said, "Can we doubt that only a divine providence placed this land, this island of freedom here, as a refuge for all those people in the world who yearn to breathe freely, Jews and Christians enduring persecution behind the Iron Curtain, the boat people of Southeast Asia, of Cuba, of Haiti, the victims of drought and famine in Africa, the freedom fighters of Afghanistan, and our own countrymen held in savage captivity." Now, he said this at the Republican convention, and he got enormous applause for this. It was broadcast to the country. Now, people think, well, that sounds nice. We're good. We're good people. But very few people stop to think, well, what does that mean in reality? That's an open invitation to permitting, welcoming even hundreds of millions, tens of millions of people from all over the world, including Haiti or everywhere in the world, because we're open to all people who are, as he puts it, victims of drought and famine, or people who are enduring persecution. But Ronald Reagan was sort of touching in how he expressed and seemed to really believe this idea about America. Things are just going to be wonderful. And he stressed this idea that America is a different kind of country. On one occasion, he said this. He says, "You can go and live in France, but you cannot become a Frenchman. You can go to live in Germany or Turkey or Japan, but you cannot become a German, a Turk, or a Japanese. But anyone from any corner of the earth can come to live in America and become an American." And he also said in the same speech, "America's freedom we are custodians of freedom for the world," he said. Now, this is a way of saying that heritage, culture, religion, race, ethnicity, those things don't matter. That America is a kind of magic country, that those things can all be put aside and it'll all work out. And he expressed this view explicitly many times. But he's not alone. Joe Biden and Barack Obama have also talked about American exceptionalism. And from their point of view, they say America is exceptional because it's the one country in the world that can be a thriving, successful, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural society without coercion. That's the theory. And Democrats believe in that. Kamala Harris, in her acceptance speech at the Democratic Convention, she said, "America is the greatest country in the world," she said. And the proof of that, her proof of American exceptionalism, is the fact that a person whose father was from India, a mother from Jamaica, was nominated to be president of the United States. That shows how great America is for her. Well, now Americans are bumping up against the reality that America has changed already, thanks to and in policies based on this worldview. It's no longer the country it was up until the 1950s, an overwhelmingly white European society. Because when you enunciate and proclaim these principles of universalism, which both Republicans and Democrats have done, policies follow inevitably from these principles. And those policies mean welcoming lots and lots of people from Somalia, from Haiti, from Peru, from Burma, from every country in the world. And Americans look around and they don't like what they see. The idea that the problems that come from that kind of racial, ethnic, cultural diversity just will not happen in America is harder and harder to sustain. So anyway, this idea of American exceptionalism has also been reinforced by popular American culture. During the 1940s, 50s, I guess into the 60s, there was a popular television show called The Lone Ranger. And in The Lone Ranger, It was this masked man whose identity was very vague, and he would come to a town or a place, and there'd be problems caused by some bad person, schemers, crooks, thieves, and so forth. And he and his, as they say, his loyal Indian friend Tonto would come in and bump heads, make things good again, and then take off again. This is a kind of American idea that if there's problems, it's because bad people are creating those problems. And that a man like the Lone Ranger and also Superman, they come in, fix things, and then things are good again. But this is fantastic because people like the Lone Ranger or Superman, they're not real people. They don't have family, they don't have parents, they don't have children. They sort of come from nowhere. Well, in the case of Superman, he comes from a planet that's been destroyed. His parents are gone. He doesn't have any real brothers or sisters. And in foreign policy, one of the very dangerous aspects of this is the idea that if there's problems around the world, it's because bad people are creating the problems, and America can go in like Superman, knock some heads around, kick ass, as they say, and then things will be okay because America is doing good. And also, like Superman, if he's not doing good, he's just Clark Kent. He proves he's good by fighting bad guys. That's also a very interesting aspect of this kind of American exceptional idea that because we're good, we prove we're good by fighting bad people. And always there's new bad people to be found all the time. And modern American foreign policy has been framed over and over and over again in terms of good guys and bad guys, which completely ignores underlying real issues that have led to these conflicts that are not just simplistic battles between good and evil.
A lot to unpack there. One point that I am actually in agreement with you that I've been stressing about is how you mentioned that there are exceptional features of the US, but they're actually concrete, like its geography. Because if you look at the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, they function as de facto moats for the US. And that has shielded it from not only invasions, but also from a lot of the nasty blowback and side effects of its ill-fated military incursions. Well, for the most part, minus 9/11, which was blowback for its like interventions in Afghanistan, but it's largely protected it from a lot of invasions. Because if you could contrast that to say like Poland or countries like Ukraine or Poland, one or two bad geopolitical moves and you're basically going to end up under the suzerainty of, like, say, historically speaking, Russia or Germany in one shape or the other. Like moves like that in Europe, which is relatively flat land that is easy for armies to traverse, could mean like your absolute liquidation as a society, or at least be forced under dominion of an external actor. That's just not been the case in the US. But the obsession I see with a lot of the American exceptionalist crowd is that they think it's like an abstraction for them, and that we're like somehow like magically superior. Do you see some of this mindset in like US political culture almost predating the foundation of it? Because when I look at like the city upon a hill, like the John Winthrop statement he made way back before the founding of the US Republic, do you think that it's kind of like been in like the North American spirit, if you will, and it's just been perverted by subsequent generations?
There's a couple of points in response, because you touched on a number of issues here. First of all, with the idea of American exceptionalism and foreign policy. The foreign policy of the United States since the end of the 19th and early 20th century is very different than it had been up until that time. Up until that time, Americans wanted to stay out of foreign countries. They wanted to stay out of foreign conflicts. They wanted to stay out of the conflicts of Europe and of other countries. The focus was on developing this country. For example, the Statue of Liberty, which was a gift to France, to the United States, was not to represent a welcoming to immigrants. It was to emphasize that America is a country that's a country of freedom and so forth here, and that America proves its good, or its goodness lies in developing its own society uniquely because it is a kind of different society than others. And so, yes, there has been a big change, but this kind of hubris, because America has been prosperous and so forth, has led to the astonishing arrogance of a Woodrow Wilson in the First World War, who proclaimed, when he asked for a declaration of war in 1914, that the United States was doing it not because of any serious threats to its sovereignty or its interests, but to make the world safe for democracy, the whole world safe for democracy. A similar kind of hubris, a kind of arrogance was true at the end of the Second World War. Now, but going back to another point that you touched on. Yes, the fact that America has these wonderful oceans to keep us out of wars means that Americans look at war differently than other countries. And I was very struck by this when I was very young, when I was already 18, 19 in Europe. And I was very struck that Europeans and people around the world look at war differently than Americans. Because for America, our wars are overseas, with the exception of the Civil War, of course, which actually wasn't even all that bad except for people in the South. American wars take place overseas. So win or lose, whether it's in Vietnam or Iraq, Afghanistan, wherever it happens to be, First World War, Second World War, American soldiers go off, American sailors and so forth fight, and win or lose, they come back and life goes on. We don't feel the effects of war in the way that other countries do. And there's a kind of amnesia, a kind of indifference to the enormous destruction that these wars cause in other countries, because we don't really feel them. We don't sense that. There's so many examples of this. I'm sure they occur to you and anybody else listening to what we're saying. And we don't even hold our leaders responsible for wars, the consequences of wars. I mean, a good example is George W. Bush. He basically lied. His administration lied to the public to justify the invasion, bombing, and occupation of Iraq in an effort that proved, I think, really a fiasco. By everybody sort of admits that, but nobody holds him accountable, because the idea that many people have is, well, if his intentions were good, that's okay. That's enough. And so George Bush is living nicely, and he's giving talks every now and then and plays golf, I suppose, and so forth. But there's no consequences, because Americans don't feel the consequences of war the way people did in Asia or in Europe or in other Africa and so forth. And so it's also contributes to this kind of arrogance, the idea that, well, that's because we're better. We don't really worry about it. And again, there's other examples of this. But anyway, those are good points you made, and I think they fit in very well with this discussion about how America sees itself in the world from this kind of American exceptional point of view.
I also think that when you brought up Reagan, that this is really important, because Ronald Reagan has, in one shape or form, has been an inspiration to all factions of the Republican Party, even the so-called populist types, to like Trump and his set. And one problem I see with the so-called America First, America Nationalist movement is that they're playing this weird double game where they have like their foot in the kind of like American supremacist primacy door, and then they have their foot in this populist door where it will entail like a reduction of the US's footprint abroad, and also a rollback of a lot of its like multicultural policies. But you have to commit in one way or the other, or else you have like a very schizophrenic, jumbled agenda that will not make any sense and will actually become politically unpopular with time. Do you see any viability of like the current of like nationalism in the US taking root? or will it have to take a very different form for it to like become politically relevant and actually implement good policies?
Well, there's a problem because we're talking right now, of course, when we talk about American policy, we're talking about the Trump administration. And the Trump administration is different. It's not even normal in the abnormal way that Democratic or Republican administrations have been in the past. It's very much the policy of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is a strange individual. Just a few weeks ago, he announced that the United States was going to take control and possession, he said, of the Gaza Strip, this Palestinian land, and turn it into a Riviera. And he was going to kick out all the people. But it'd be great because he'll be building wonderful, beautiful resorts, I guess, and creating, as he says, jobs for a lot of people. There's no other politician, Democrat, Republican, of any party that would come up with an idea like that or articulate it as Donald Trump did. It represents him in a uniquely Trumpian way. His experience, of course, and background is as a builder in New York City. And so he sort of thinks in that way. And he, more than any other president I've known in U.S. history, has this highly personal way of looking at things. He personalizes things. And he does that both in domestic politics and internationally. So when we're talking about how it affects policy, yes, it affects it. But Donald Trump is kind of a joker. He's unusual. He's an outlier. So and also Donald Trump will take credit for anything that goes well. He, of course, disavows any responsibility when things do not go well. And so it's very different than kind of normal. Now, having said that, both Republicans and Democrats are really trying to uphold a place in the world that is really no longer sustainable in the way it was for 70 some years since the end of the Second World War. It's become now, to use this overworked phrase, a much more multipolar society. But there's an enormous hypocrisy in all of this. The United States thinks it's a very bad thing if foreign countries tell Americans or try how to vote or how they should think. They don't like interference by foreign countries. But even this administration, and of course the Biden administration, think it's just fine if America interferes in other countries and tells them how to vote and what to do and what to think. And this was illustrated just the other week when J.D. Vance went to Munich and lectured Europeans on how they ought to be and they should do this or that in a way that, of course, he would find it very arrogant and bad if Sweden or Argentina or Japan started lecturing Americans about how we ought to do things. And even though Democrats and Republicans may disagree about all sorts of things, they both seem to think that American exceptionalism means that the rules that we apply to other countries don't apply to us. We get to do what we want because we're special. If we do things, they're inherently good because we're a good country. And that's a dangerous thing that an outlook that I think both Democrats and Republicans have shown over and over again. I think it's most obvious right now because there's a consensus of both Democrats and Republicans that the United States has to support Israel, apparently, regardless of what Israel does. And it's a relationship that's not based on any sober, concrete evaluation of America's real strategic interests in the region or in the world, much less on any moral considerations. It's a reflection of the tremendous power that the organized Jewish community has in America. And so very often these lofty principles and that American politicians will express are really kind of slogans for just pushing their own interests in their own way or the interests of somebody who has power rather than any real sincere application or adherence to these principles that they proclaim. And again, in the case of the Trump administration and the Biden administration, both of them are try to justify what I think by any objective standard is very difficult to justify its policies with Israel. And one of the consequences, Donald Trump is so unique. He has shaken things up, forcing people to really reevaluate their whole relationship with the United States. And it's making people really look ask some deeper questions. The result of that has been that in his just a few weeks he's been in office in this administration, he has managed to anger, frustrate, enrage countries, people around the world, even in countries that have traditionally been close to the United States, including Canada or Germany or France or so forth. That's a pretty remarkable thing, because Donald Trump looks at the world in this very odd, transactional, business-like way, in which concern for Europe is no more important than concern, I guess, for any other country, except that is only in terms of what we get out of it. And that's, I think, a very dangerous way to look at the world, because human beings and the world are not just business transactions. It fails to really appreciate that these are human beings, and human beings live for something more than just business interests, in the way that Donald Trump seems to look at things.
Yes, I think that we are in a weird transitional moment, because you brought up the point of how Republicans and Democrats are essentially clinging to a bygone era of the so-called unipolar moment. And the world is just changing. But Trump, in my view, still maintain, despite all the bombast and the way he conducts foreign affairs, which is, as you said, rather bizarre and strange, he does have like these residual elements of like the uniparty consensus on a host of issues, ranging from legal immigration to fanatic Zionism. But I do think that we are in a transition period towards some type of shakeup. I don't know what it's going to look like. Based on your historical readings of like the liberal international order and the backlash towards it that we've seen, ranging from not only like Trump, but also the rise of like the National Front in France and the AfD in Germany, where do you think things are heading in the West these days?
Well, Donald Trump is president because he's a protest candidate. Americans are very unhappy with the direction America has been going in the last 20, 30 years. And Donald Trump personifies and expresses the frustration that millions of Americans feel. He doesn't have a clear vision of the kind of country he wants, except that it's supposed to be great. He wants it to be prosperous and great. He's a civic nationalist in that way. He doesn't have any real concern for heritage, culture, race, religion. Those things don't really matter to him. But Donald Trump in America and the AfD in Germany, the National Rally in France, and other populist nationalist similar parties are protest parties. It's not clear at all what a French government run by Marine Le Pen and the National Rally would be actually like in France, or it's unclear what its relationship with the United States would be, or for the AfD in Germany. And Donald Trump, again, he's shaking things up, but he's not shaking things up in a fundamental. His policies are very applauded by his supporters, but he's not changing the basic cultural, demographic character of the United States. And the problem, and one of the reasons why he will not, quote unquote, usher in what he calls the so-called golden age of America, is because he's not really interested in dealing with the reasons why it's not a golden age. He thinks that laws and changing, cleaning up the government and so forth will bring a fundamental change. It won't. It won't return America to what it was, because the country has changed. The most obvious thing is that the population of the United States has changed from the time of his youth. When he was a boy, America was something 90% a European country. Today, that's no longer true. And the consequences of that, he would like to just sort of set aside. He wants to sort of return, even though the reality has changed demographically, culturally, and so forth in the United States. And that's one of the reasons why I very much think that there'll be some really major blow-ups or pushback in the maybe the second year, third year of his administration. Right now, nobody has yet, it's too early to see the impact of his policies. There's a lot of things that could go very, very wrong with the administration. But but anyway, the important thing is that these parties are protest parties in France, Germany, the United States, but they haven't yet, and their leaders do not clearly define exactly what is important. In Germany, the United States insisted after the Second World War that a German nationalism was a bad thing. The German constitution, what they call the Basic Law, proclaims that Germany is committed to what it calls the liberal democratic basic order, and that the European Union believes that more important than the heritage or the ethnic cultural identity of Europe is its embrace and support of liberal democracy. Well, that's, I think, silly, because Europe long before liberal democracy was in the ascendant, and it will still be Europe after this post-war era passes away. And countries are more important than the form of government they have or the form of political organization they have. But Donald Trump has has speeded up the process that's already been in place of America's change in the world and its changing relationship with Europe and with other countries. And it's forcing Europeans to reassess their relationship with the United States and even ask some very fundamental questions for themselves about what's really important for the countries of Europe.
There's one point that I've heard you mention on several podcasts before about the demographic situation in the United States, especially when we hear talks about abolishing birthright citizenship, which Donald Trump's executive order at the start of his presidency ostensibly undermined, more or less. That's stuck in the courts now. But I've heard you mention something to the effect that even if you got some immigration restriction measures in place, the demographic damage has already been done. And so I ask you this: when do you think that the demographic point of no return was reached in the U.S.? And how would you go? How would visionary statesmen try to reverse that, if it's even possible?
Well, there's several aspects to answering your question. Yeah, Donald Trump he wants to stop birthright citizenship. There's a wide consensus in the American public that they're in favor of that, but he's not against changing the multicultural, multi-ethnic nature of American society, and that trend has been going on for years and will continue, even if all immigration stopped tomorrow. Even if immigration stopped tomorrow, that trend would continue. And the Republican Party embraces it. At the Republican National Convention, it was a kind of celebration of cultural, racial diversity at the Republican Convention, and there's no secret about that. Cracking down or getting rid of birthright citizenship is a kind of common sense thing. It was a stupid thing even as long as it's been in place. But he still believes this idea that basically America can still work and be great again, even when it's very inherently very, very divided in ways that are not going to be changed no matter what his immigration policy happens to be. You ask, when did it change? When did it become too late? That's a hard thing to say, because it's not when the impact of policies or an ideology kick in. It's when the thinking goes bad. I think America really changed. There's two dates that I would think are pretty important. One is 1898. In 1898, by the way, this was under the administration of William McKinley, who Donald Trump went out of his way to praise in his inaugural address. William McKinley was responsible for the Spanish-American War. And the Spanish-American War, Americans felt very proud that America had joined the ranks of the imperial countries, The United States acquired control over Cuba, Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. It was also at that time that the United States acquired Hawaii, and Americans felt, well, the British have an empire, the French have an empire, Germans, other people have an empire. We're going to have an empire too. And people rallied around the flag for the Spanish-American War, even though it was launched on the basis of a pretext, of a lie. A U.S. battleship had blown up, which the United States blamed Spain for. But the point is, that was already a big problem, a change from America's traditional thing, because America, as a result of the Spanish-American War, made Puerto Rico American, part of the United States. Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. Now, that already changes America's kind of idea of itself, because up until that time, Americans sort of had the view that no, this is a white country. We don't want to acquire foreign areas if we can avoid it. We don't want to acquire, and we want to maintain who we are and stay out of the imperial game. We don't want to be the kind of country that we broke away from. America broke away from the British Empire. So, but Americans were sort of intoxicated by the thrill of being tough and playing a role in the world, which McKinley and also then the next president, Theodore Roosevelt, really played up. But there was a great debate in the country at that time over these issues, and a very strong voicing of fear and anxiety about what America getting on this path would mean. The other big change came during the Franklin Roosevelt administration, when during the Second World War, for the first time, American officially in propaganda and films and so forth took the view that America is a country for everyone. That's not the way Americans thought of their country. They knew that, of course, that there was a minority of African Americans and so forth, but they were considered sort of off to the side. There was a very strong consensus that this is a white country, a European country. But the Roosevelt administration was more explicit. No, it's a universal society. And Franklin Roosevelt and American leaders proclaimed this. And then that led to that change in identity as America during the Second World War, and then even became more and more pronounced in the years after that, 1950s and 60s, until by the 1970s, Americans had even changed their own attitudes about the United States. So those were two very major changes in American attitude, reinforced by Hollywood, motion pictures, radio, television, in schools, and so forth. And now, so I would say that was just the changing of attitude is more important than the changing of policy, because the policies changed in line with the change in you might say, the official ideology. And so when you say, well, when was it too late? Well, it was already once. See, Americans, very often, the average American doesn't really think in terms of ideology or principles. He's not really concerned if things are bad in Detroit. He's concerned of how is it in my neighborhood? How is it for me? And they don't really think about problems like immigration or racial problems until it affects them in their neighborhoods. Then they're angry. Then they think, oh my gosh, we got to do something about this. Well, by then it's too late.
Yeah.
It's too late. Yeah. And so when you say, well, when is it too late? It's too late when the problems are in your face. The time to have dealt with it. A responsible government deals with it because the leaders are able to foresee what the consequences will be based on understanding of history. That's the whole point of emphasizing history, because you can predict with almost absolute certainty that when you have certain principles and policies in place, various reality will follow, and there'll be some real consequences of that. But Americans don't like to think about that. They like to think we're not like other countries that have ideologies. We just get the job done. We just deal with problems when they arise. Well, see, that's a misreading of life, because fundamental problems of identity and citizenship, ethnicity, culture, those things are not just problems you can deal with in an ad hoc way. They have to be based on a fundamental agreement about basic principles. And so the consequence of that is, the result of that is it's a very bad thing, because Americans are very confused about what does it mean to be an American. At the Republican convention, a speech was given at the last Republican convention by Vivek Ramaswamy, and he said America has a crisis of identity. He said we have, and so he offered his proposal for a new American identity, and it was so banal and silly. He said, "Well, we have to unite people on the basis that we want a society in which the laws represent the people, and the law it's a country of laws, and basically." The principles he enunciated aren't uniquely American. They're true of basically every country in the world. But he thinks that that's the way to unite America. Well, it won't, because they're not uniquely, there's nothing unique about them. Of course, every country strives for, and I guess agrees with, that the government should represent the interests of its people, and that it proclaims laws, and the laws should be obeyed, and that they should be administered justly. Well, people agree with that in Botswana and Peru and Japan. Nobody disagrees basically with that principle, but that's not enough to hold the country together. And when J.D. Vance was speaking in Munich at this conference, he talked about how we're on basically the same team, he said, and we still feel something with Europe. Well, on what basis? Why should Americans have any more concern for Europe than for Japan, or for Thailand, or any other country? He doesn't give a good reason. Is it democracy? What is it? Is it freedom of speech? Well, that's not really a good basis for a foundation for an alliance, and so he leaves unsaid. Both Vance and Trump and the Democrats refuse to really say, well, what is it that makes America? Who is an American? For Donald Trump, he wants to make Canadians Americans, but he wants to make Canada a state, but not Puerto Rico. Why not? Why isn't Puerto Rico a state? If Canada should be a state, interestingly enough, why one state? Why anyway, it's rather confusing. But anyway, Canada has two official languages, French and English. Puerto Rico has two official languages, Spanish and English. But apparently, Puerto Rico is not as high on his level of, I guess, acquisition. He wants to expand the territory. Anyway, fundamentally, when a country it's only in times of crisis that people have to be overt and explicit about these fundamental questions of identity. When things are going well, they don't really worry about it or think about it. And we're coming to a time when it's increasingly impossible not to come to grips with these questions of who we are, and therefore what we should do.
Yeah, these are some of the big questions of our epoch that have to eventually be answered, lest the U.S. wants to disappear into the historical ether as one of the many long-lost civilizations of history. But it's a topic for another day. I think this is a good place to wrap this discussion up, Mark. So before we depart, please let my audience know where they can follow you and IHR's work.
Oh, yes, please. I urge people. I shamelessly promote the IHR. It's on the website. Website is ihr.org. There's a lot of information, a lot of material on the website, both current and historical, and on a range of issues, cultural and so forth. So I urge you to check that out. We also have an affiliated website, ihr-store.com, which sells a wide range of books and discs and so forth. So I urge people to check that out. And of course, we're be interested in any feedback and comments that people might have, and I urge you to check that out then.
All right. Thank you so much, Mark, for taking the time out of your day to do this interview. And also to my audience, thank you for your attention as always. And with that, El Niño has spoken.